Hi and welcome to Mind 123. My name is Jo Rushton and I'm being joined here today by Dr. Daron Scher, and we are going to be speaking about nutrition, but in particular the subject of ketogenic dieting. Dr. Daron Scher, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about how to read a nutritional label specific to being on a ketogenic diet. Now, before we dive into that, what I'd love us to get a little clearer on is how much protein, fat, and carbohydrate should we be eating per day when we're on a ketogenic diet?
That's a great question. The essence of the ketogenic diet is to have a very low carbohydrate intake. Most people then think they have to go high protein, but that's not where you get all your nutrition and energy from. So we want carbohydrates for most people less than 20 grams per day. If you're metabolically well, not unhealthy, you may be able to tolerate more than that. Protein, it's a moderate protein way of eating. So for most people, 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day of their lean body weight. So if someone weighs 150 kilos and needs to lose 50 of them, we're not going to give them that much protein. So it's lean body weight. And the last segment is fat. And how much fat do you eat? Until you're full or you're no longer hungry. So we don't actually limit or put a maximum or minimum amount on the fat. The fat is for your satiety. And so that's where reading the nutritional label becomes so important. Okay,
and just before we go on to the nutritional label, are there any variables like, the more someone might exercise or their physical activity at work in a day, do any other things come in to influence the changing of those averages that you've given us?
So unless you're a high-performance athlete, an almost professional person, the short answer is no. Those are the numbers that we shoot for in most people. Now, if you're metabolically unwell, if you're diabetic, if you've got insulin resistance, we may even restrict the carbs further because they may create a problem for you. Now, there are some groups that may need a little bit more protein, up to 2 grams, if you're doing some powerlifting or that sort of activity. But generally speaking, even high-performance people can manage at those levels.
Okay, just recap those for me. 20 grams, no more, of carbohydrates per day?
Correct.
What about the protein?
1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of lean body weight. So generally it's probably around 70 grams a day. Mm-hmm. But with that you need to remember that, for example, meat is only about 20% protein. So it's not necessarily the weight of the meat, but the protein content that you're interested in.
Okay.
Yes.
And the fat?
There's no upper limit or lower limit on fat. You eat fat until you feel full. So the vegetables that you eat, you need to cook in fat so that the vegetable acts as a conduit to get more fat into you.
Okay, fantastic. So with that, let's move on to understanding how to read a food label relative to being on a ketogenic diet. What's the very first thing that we need to make sure we do?
So don't believe anything that's written on the front of the box. All right, so make sure you turn the package over and look on the other side. You'll see a series of segments to the nutrition label. The first is the ingredients down the bottom, but then you've got 2 segments, one per serve and the other per 100 gram. You need to be very careful of the per serve because the manufacturer has decided what the per serve size is. So we discussed before, a breakfast cereal, they may only allocate 50 grams of the serve, whereas you may actually eat 150 grams for breakfast. Now, on a ketogenic diet, you're not going to be eating the breakfast cereal, so that's just an example anyway. But the per 100 grams tells you what's actually in the food. And that's the first thing I want you to look at. I want you to shift over, ignore the first column, and look at the second column, which says per 100 grams. The first thing you're going to look at is the sugar or carbohydrate content of the food. And for a ketogenic diet, that needs to be 5 or less per 100 grams. Anything above that will be giving you too much carbohydrate for you to stay under the ratio that you need. After that, we go to protein. And we, again, want to make sure that we're not overeating on our protein because protein in itself can stimulate an insulin response, which will stimulate weight gain. The last thing is the fat. we want the fat content to be as high as possible. So you may find a food that is low in carbohydrate, has the right level of protein, but is also low in fat. And the problem with that food is it's not going to make you feel full. So if you've got two choices, one with low fat, one with high fat, you choose the high fat option.
Okay. And so is there a grammage of protein? So I know, as you said, nothing more than 5 grams per 100 grams of the carbohydrate. Is there a range that we're looking for the amount of protein in per 100 grams of the product?
Not really. We're not too worried because we're more worried about what your overall 24-hour intake is rather than on any one particular product. But generally speaking, the higher the fat, the better.
Okay. So we're looking at no more than 5 grams per 100 grams of carbohydrate.
Correct.
We aren't too worried about the number of grams per 100 grams of protein.
Correct.
But we're definitely looking for a higher percentage of fat per 100 grams.
Yes.
Okay, because that gives us our satiation. There's nothing worse than, feeling full but still hungry.
Correct.
Okay.
So then the last thing that we need to look at is the actual ingredients of the food. Now, they're listed in order of the maximum to the minimum. So the first 3 are really the bulk of what is in that food. And the most important thing is make sure that sugar isn't listed as one of those first 3 ingredients. Because if sugar is listed as one of those first 3 ingredients, it's not a food that you should be eating. And the other thing is you need to look out for the hidden names of sugar because there are a lot of different names that sugar can be called and you may not recognize it actually as sugar. Okay,
so just for our audience, for them to understand a little bit more of that, is that things like, I was always taught, when words finished in OSE, so we're thinking of glucose, sucrose, multidextrose or dextrose, that they're sort of the hidden sugars you're talking about?
Absolutely. And then they start putting in things like cane sugar or cane juice or beet sugar, and then you get the impression that because it's come from beetroot that it's actually a healthy product, but it's not. It's still just sugar.
I read somewhere, in fact it was on a great website, sugarscience.org, that there is some 61 different words that they are now using in marketing to disguise sugar.
Absolutely.
Because I think people are getting more savvy on, really looking for those hidden sugars. So what's next? What about additives? Is that something that we need to, worry about? And how do we know what an additive is on a label?
Look, that's a difficult one because unfortunately, unless it reaches a certain percentage of the whole food, you don't actually need to have it on the nutrition label at all. And this is, again, part of the problem of buying processed foods as opposed to shopping at the edge of the supermarket where you're getting foods in a more natural state and you know what's added to it or not. Of course, the more additives there are, the more likely it is to create inflammation. And part of the ketogenic diet is an anti-inflammatory diet. You want to increase your omega-3s, you want to reduce your omega-6s, and with the ingredients, you want to stay away from seed oils and vegetable oils, which are often the second or third ingredient. And if you've got a choice between something having olive oil or a seed oil with 2 products, choose the one with the olive oil.
So a great example of what we've been talking about, being able to read a food label relative to a ketogenic diet, you've got here a great example of 2 products. They're both yogurts. So just point out for me a summary of what we've spoken about.
One of the things, the reason we choose the yogurt is because in the supermarket there are often a section called kids yogurts. And the sad thing about that is when you turn it over, you see that the kids' yogurts actually have more sugar than the adults' yogurts. So if we have a Greek-style pot-set yogurt over here, we see the carbohydrate is 3.6 grams per 100 grams, and the fat is 9.9 grams per 100 grams, with a saturated fat of 6.5 grams. And so from a ketogenic perspective, that's a fantastic product. That's really what we're looking for. And what's in it? Milk, cream, and live yogurt cultures. So fantastic. There's nothing pro-inflammatory there at all, nothing to be worried about. So now let's go to this healthy kids blackberry and pomegranate yogurt. So the first thing that we notice is that the carbohydrate is 18 grams per 100 grams. So there's a lot of sugar. Nearly 20% of this product is sugar. If we go to the fat's 5.8 grams, so it's less than half, or not quite half, of what we had in the Greek-style yogurt. And then, most importantly, let's go to the ingredients. So milk, sugar solids, blended fruit, water, sugar, pomegranate juice reconstituted, natural flavors, acidity regulators. So you can see there's an enormous difference in those two products with all of the additives and the amount of sugar that you're going to get from the product. And if you read the front of the label, it tells you that it's a healthy kids yogurt, but you flip it over and read the true nutrition label, there's no way you'd let your kid eat that.
Okay, so in summary, we want to make sure that we're looking at the per 100 gram serve rather than the per serve.
Yes.
We're wanting to make sure we look at carbohydrates first, nothing over 5 grams per 100 grams. We want to then look at what the protein is and then what the fat is. And then we go down and have a look at the ingredients. And so long as it's, you know, in the first 3 things that are listed, that sugar isn't in those first 3 things, because that's just going to blow out our whole ketogenic process.
Yes.
Then we just want to make sure that the least amount of ingredients on an ingredients list, the better it is for us.
Correct.
Okay, well, I think we've heard it here today. We know now with a lot more confidence how we can read a food label. Thank you so much.
Thank you.